Hi, I'm Erik Voss, and this is a breakdown of Legion's third episode, Chapter 3. And this was somehow both the scariest and the sexiest episode of Legion so far. And I'm pretty messed up, so to me, scary and sexy are pretty much the same thing. I'm gonna break down all the visuals and missable stuff in this episode, as well as some new stuff from the first two episodes. So let's get started with these opening images. And as usual, there's a lot to unpack in this opening montage, so let's talk about the visuals first. So David is seeing two types of images. First, there are the dark, intense shots of Division 3 with Amy being tortured with leeches. David sees all of this through the screen of one of those video monitors at the Division as if he's complicit in Amy's pain. And to represent David's fear for his sister, our good friend, the devil with the yellow eyes, comes back. Meanwhile, David balances all these dark images with warm, pleasant images of things that he likes, like childhood memories and, whoa, steamy shower nudes. So this balance reflects David's attempt to set his mind at ease, focusing on saving his sister Amy while also keeping that fear from completely overtaking him. And by the way, the reason David is visualizing these shower shots specifically is we learn later that ever since he swapped bodies with Sydney, he can still physically feel what it was like to be in her body. So as he showers, he feels himself bathing her body, which is why we see both of their bodies cross-dissolving into each other. And this isn't just pervy shower thoughts. There's actually an important reason that these two share a physical connection, which I'll talk about later. Also, notice how throughout this montage we hear the voice of the I, aka Walter, saying several times over and over. We also see some repetition of the shot of David's dog fetching the ball. So all these opening instances of repetition set up the recurring theme of repetition throughout this episode. Like a lot of what we see in this hour are shots from before, replayed in David's memory. And when you repeat things over and over, you begin to notice patterns and connections that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. Kind of like how I watch these episodes of Legion 8 times and begin to see eyes everywhere, like eyes, 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 everywhere, eyes. Similarly, David needs to repeat traumatic moments from his life over and over so that he and Melanie can begin to interpret meaning from them. And another important theme is set up in the Woodcutter story.
While you wait, have you heard the story of the poor woodcutter and his wife?
Told to us by Oliver, the voice that we've been hearing throughout Summerland facility.
Dr. Baker's advanced time travel class has been cancelled.
Now speaking through this quirky Rube Goldbergy coffee maker. Now Oliver is voiced by Jemaine Clement, and we learn this episode that Oliver was Melanie's deceased husband who built Summerland with CARY. Anyway, this story is about a curious woodcutter and his wife ruining a good thing by trying to observe its magic. The lesson being, our insistence to understand natural phenomena leads us to lose what's good about it. In other words, curiosity kills the cat, or dissection kills the frog, or peeking at the crane scares away the crane. Just leave animals alone, guys. And in this case, David is the crane in the story, the magical creature who can do great things for Melanie. Meanwhile, Melanie is the curious woodcutter, trying to exploit David's powers and analyze him too deeply. And actually, I think the show set up this crane back at episode 1, in that shot with David sleeping in Clockworks. There was kind of an odd shadow moving on the other side of the wall, which almost looks like the wings of a large bird, maybe operating a loom. Of course, Melanie doesn't yet see how her curiosity will come back to burn her, so she pours out her coffee and starts the story over. Again, only through repetition do we find meaning. And before I move on, there's this quick shot of the two CARYs. CARY, the MRI technician, and CARY, the other mutant who rescued David in episode 1. Now, we knew from last episode that something was up with these two. Like, their names sound the same but are spelled differently, and they have the same last name, Loudermilk, which I don't think is a very common last name. And there was that moment last episode when CARY seemed to be talking to himself, and then in a later shot, the other CARY appeared in the room. And then now, the male CARY seems to absorb the female CARY, as if they're both halves of the same person who can split into these two identities, maybe one brain and the other brawn. Okay, moving on to this memory work session, and notice how the table they sit at has a large X across it. Maybe this is just me seeing patterns where there are none, but when they go into this memory, Melanie realized David has the power of telekinesis. So this X might be implying that Melanie sees even more usefulness in David as a future mutant warrior with the X-Men. And yeah, that's assuming that the X-Men will be part of the timeline on this show, which is very much not a guarantee. Now, when they go into David's memory of the fight that led to this kitchen incident, notice how when Ptonomy tries to move them out of it, he gets blocked. And David says he's not doing it. And this is followed by one of the creepiest ever appearances by the devil with the yellow eyes. So what is going on here? Well, Melanie and Ptonomy cannot see the yellow-eyed devil here, only David can. And I think that means that the devil wasn't in David's literal objective memory. He's a separate identity in David's present-day mind that's corrupting his perception of the past. And maybe he's doing that as David's current lingering fear, haunting each of these moments that he was most afraid as he looks back on them.
You saw something.
I don't know. I don't remember. It's just fear.
And the fact that the devil with the yellow eyes can prevent Ptonomy from leaving this moment shows that this identity is a powerful controlling influence. Now, I know we don't like to look at the devil with the yellow eyes for too long, but a few things to point out here. One, look at his clothes. In the past, he's worn something that looks more like rags or a potato sack, but here it looks like a suit and tie. Actually, it looks a lot like the schoolboy clothes worn by the Angriest Boy in the World figure. So, since both the Angriest Boy and the yellow-eyed devil are terrifying demonic figures that haunt and chase David through his memories, I'm wondering if they're actually just one and the same, with the Angriest Boy being a cartoon version and the yellow-eyed devil being what happens when that cartoon is transformed into something more human-like. Kind of like those creepy human versions of The Simpsons. Remember those? Gross, right? And one more quick thing to point out about this devil is notice how he keeps getting larger and larger each time we see him. Like the first episode, he appeared small, like in the background of frames. And then last episode, he appeared larger, getting closer to David, and now we're getting a pretty damn good look at him. And a lot of people have pointed this out recently, and it's amazing, so I gotta mention it. We actually saw the devil with the yellow eyes in the first seconds of the very first episode as a tiny toy on young David's floor. And notice how when the frame dissolves into another shot, the toy rolls over by itself. Creepy. So this devil with the yellow eyes has been haunting us from the very beginning, starting as a small, adorable creeper, and then evolving into a bloated, terrifying threat. And this memory work session ends with David teleporting the three of them into Melanie's office. And notice the window here, another X. In fact, it's the same X through the circle and the O of the Legion logo. And it's interesting that this session revealed two of David's newly discovered powers to Melanie, and it was bookended by these X's, possibly suggesting David's future where he could put these powers to use. Okay, moving on to my favorite scene of the episode with David and Sydney joking about all the dirty stuff they did in each other's bodies. And other than this just being a grounding character moment, it's important to set up that David still feels physiologically connected to Sydney. But also notice how Sydney says this line.
It's not my body, you know? It's just how I've come to think about it. If anyone can just come and go. It's like the soul. No one knows for sure does it exist, but I've got proof. We're more than just this. But everywhere I go, I'm me.
And this is the exact opposite of where David's head is at. His mind is filled with hundreds of identities, and he's never sure who he is. So I think that's why he's so drawn to Sydney. With her one soul mindset, she represents the constancy and stability that he wants so badly. Okay, moving on to David's lab test with CARY, and notice this exchange.
Sorry. I know you were a bit of a lab rat at Division 3.
I just don't like to be studied.
This connects back to that Woodcutter story, the dangers of curiosity. Like the Woodcutter, CARY is about to again see the harm in looking too deeply into David's abilities. Also, notice how, again, female CARY appears out of nowhere, seemingly emerging out of male CARY's back. And assuming these two are halves of one person, male CARY seems to be the cautious analyst, while female CARY seems to be a bit more emotional and impulsive. Like, notice this judgy stink eye that she gives Sydney after she reassures David. I think this means that the CARYs do not like having someone else having an influence over David outside the control of Summerland. Okay, let's move on to this Halloween memory. There's a lot of interesting things going on here. First, there's this sign in the background with David's name written shakily on it. Now, I'm not totally sure what this is, but maybe it's meant to imply that this whole memory is young David's property, the way kids write their names on books and toys. And since this is his childhood property, maybe we're not meant to interpret this literally, the way that we can't really trust anything we see on the show. Then notice David's costume. He's dressed up in what looks like an astronaut or a spaceman of some kind. That could be something he picked because his dad or his father figure told him that he was an astronomer, and David just loves space. But remember in the previous scene what Lenny kept calling David's girlfriend.
An astronaut approaches. UNHAND!
the reptile, space captain.
And maybe that means that David's girlfriend, like everyone in his past, perhaps, is another identity that he created in his head. Also, what exactly is this dog's name? Like every time these kids have said it, it kind of sounds like King, but then when young David looks through the fence here, he clearly says cake.
King!
And remember what David said in that earlier scene.
Do you smell cake?
So either that vapor enhanced his ability to smell a store-bought cake in a box in another room, or maybe part of him is referring to his lost dog. And really, I just think the point of all these connections is to intertwine all of David's past trauma. The night he lost his dog, leading to this scare from the angriest boy in the world, and then the day his kitchen exploded, leading to this scare from the devil with the yellow eyes. Also, I love the ways that this moment warns us of the scare that's coming. First, as David hears his dad reading the story, his voice is overlaid with the demonic voice of the devil with the yellow eyes.
His face turned red, and with a cry, he chopped her head.
Then there's that creepy little music sting that we heard in the first episode with the devil and then last episode with the bedtime story. And then finally, notice how when David approaches the fence, the color of this shot suddenly shifts to this yellow tone. Now, obviously color is a huge part of Legion, and the color yellow, along with those audio effects I mentioned, are connecting this monster with the yellow-eyed devil monster, which I'm thinking more and more are, yeah, the same monster. Now, back in the lab, David's present-day mind is haunted by Lenny, who makes David feel paranoid about Melanie and guilty for what might be happening to his sister.
Who knows how many commandos are gang-banging your sister right in the cornhole.
Now, it's interesting that Lenny uses this crass sexual imagery here, and I think it's because David's mind lately has been fixated with other sexual imagery, with Sydney. And Lenny is trying to make him feel guilty for having those pleasurable sexual thoughts by turning sex into something negative. You know, just an armchair psychologist here. Also, notice how Lenny briefly transforms into Amy, begging David to save her, but really just taunting him.
They're hurting me with their big, hard.
She's about to say dicks. Maybe it's just me, but this reminds me of that one scene in The Wizard of Oz where the Wicked Witch of the West pretends to be Auntie M just to screw with Dorothy.
Letty, don't go away! I'm frightened! Come back! Come back! I'll give you any
This part scared the crap out of me as a kid. Like, how is this a kid's movie? Now, to this epic moment when David floats out of the chair, I've talked a lot about color in this show, and again, notice how the light flashes on David and Sydney's faces, flickering from red to blue. Now, this show has used red light in the past as an alarm, signaling something bad about to happen. Meanwhile, I've been noticing that blue light might be a place of comfort for David, specifically with Sydney. Remember in episode 1, that reflection kiss moment in Clockworks. They were both bathed in this nice blue light, until the scary red light snapped David out of the moment. And I think a similar color effect is being used here, with Sydney trying to anchor him in the blue light, but the red light taking him out of the moment. And then when David and Sydney astro project to where Amy is held, a few things to point out here. First, this old man from episode 1 quotes Amy as saying,
"Didn't you once tell your husband it felt like you grew up in a haunted house?"
So not only did Amy know that David's issues weren't just mental problems, but actual supernatural abilities, and I guess she just blocked this out, the idea of the Holler House being a haunted house sets up the whole horror movie aesthetic that closes out this episode. Also, notice that the clock on the wall has no hands. I actually think we saw this before too. Maybe this is one of those things like how there are no clocks in casinos to make it easy to lose track of time, and in this case, it's a mind game that these torturers are playing on Amy. But it might also be like an aesthetic choice to distinguish this place from Clockworks. In Clockworks, it was all about putting in the time and fixing your brain so that it runs like clockwork. Here in Division 3, time is irrelevant. They're not trying to fix anything, only hurt and control and contain. We also get a clue for why Walter is called the Eye. Notice how he's able to see David and Sydney's astral projections. So I'm guessing that part of his power is sensing when mutants are present or using their powers. And when David and Sydney teleport back to the Summerland waterfront, notice this close-up of dye droplets in the water. Now, this could be depicting the dye that CARY injected into David to track his stress hormones, but this shot also mirrors the close-up of the vapor droplets that that Lenny dropped into the frog to get high last episode. But in this case, the shot is moving in reverse. So this could mean that instead of that destructive downward drug trip that David took with Lenny, David is now experiencing an upward reverse trip with Sidney. Okay, let's fast forward through Melanie explaining the history of Walter, the Eye, and Oliver in Summerland and her plan to sedate David and David's vapor trip dream, and talk about this moment between David and Sidney in the bathroom. Notice what David says when he quotes his therapist.
The word monster is not a noun. That to be a monster, you first gotta do something monstrous.
So David is struggling with his guilt and his identity issues. He knows this monstrous presence exists in his mind, but he's learned that that inner demon won't make him a monster unless he acts on it. So if he can control his actions and rescue his sister, he will know that he's not a monster. And again, the coloring of the scene is awesome, connecting back to David and Sidney's relationship. The yellow light covers part of David's face, reflecting the nagging fear that the yellow-eyed demon will take over and turn him into a monster. But when he turns to Sidney, he's connected with her in this calming blue light, and he's able to leave that nagging yellow fear behind him. Okay, moving on to this crazy memory work sequence with David under sedation. Now, I should say that all of this is definitely reminiscent of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, specifically Dream Warriors, because in that sequel, the heroes are mental patients who band together to go into their nightmare together to investigate and defeat the demonic boogeyman Freddy Krueger. And obviously, that's pretty similar to what David and Sidney are doing here. Now, earlier this episode mentioned a haunted house, and I love how this final sequence connects all of David's fearful locales as part of one impossible designed haunted house. There's Dr. Poole's office, David's apartment, and his childhood home, all under one creepy roof. And this scene here hints at this whole spatial link with this clever transition, with the camera floating through the Summerland window into the alleyway outside as if they were right next to each other. Okay, so Melanie explains that the reason David is a child in this memory is that his defenses are lowered from the sedation, because they still think it was him blocking them before, not the yellow-eyed demon. So instead of a grown man, he's depicted as a weaker, innocent young boy. And again, it's important to see David and Sidney making physical contact here, because I think it's that physical connection from when they swap bodies is the reason why Sidney can see the devil with the yellow eyes while Melanie and Ptonomy can't. Like when David's mind went into her body, so did the ability to perceive all of his inner demons. Now, in David's memory of robbing Dr. Poole, he sees these projections of himself, Poole, and the recording of their session. Ptonomy realizes that they're seeing
memories within memories.
As Junkie David realizes that he needs to destroy the evidence of his relationship with Poole. And when he goes into those recording files, notice the names on the other tapes. Now, I don't know who Robinson, Abernathy, or Dirksunger are, but I'm guessing that Plaza is a reference to Aubrey Plaza, Lenny, with Mr. a possible reference to the fact that the character was originally written to be male. And it's confirmed here that the shot of David eating spools of tape that we saw in the first episode are indeed happening in this moment. And this might just be me, but this reminds me of another horror movie moment from The Ring, when a woman had that electrode cord down her throat. It's just unsettling to see people put in or take out these things that don't belong in their mouths. And then as this memory transforms into a legit haunted house with this unnerving image of the yellow-eyed devil pushing through this hellish fissure in the wall, check out how this widescreen cinematic aspect ratio returns. In episodes 1 and 2, the show used this visual to suggest a sense of dread and danger. And this moment with young David and Sidney in the memory of David having sex with his old girlfriend is interesting. Like before, David's subconscious is trying to comfort himself with sexual imagery, and it leads to this super awkward moment for Sidney. Like, kid, you're either gonna traumatize yourself or freak out your older self. Either way, let's just go watch cartoons, okay? And when the angriest boy in the world demon chases them down the hallway, notice how it becomes the yellow-eyed devil once it appears in the vent. Again, more evidence that these two are the same monster. And this whole scene reminds me of another Nightmare on Elm Street movie, Wes Craven's New Nightmare. So along with Dream Warriors, New Nightmare is really the only sequel worth watching, in my opinion. Like, it's a crazy meta version of the story where Freddy haunts the actors in the movie Nightmare on Elm Street. And like this episode of Legion, that movie ends with the boogeyman chasing and terrorizing a woman and a little boy inside a nightmare. And with Melanie alone in the memory haunted house, she actually gets our first look at David's parents or parental figures. They look at her suddenly threatened, kind of like the family in that house at the end of Insidious. Also, notice how Melanie follows the sound of the dog, King or Cake or whatever it is, whimpering inside David's closet. Now again, I think this could mean something bad happened to this poor dog, and that could be one of the dark memories that David is blocking out. And that brings Melanie to this book, The World's Angriest Boy in the World. And you may have noticed that that title is redundant, right? Like the word world is in it twice. And I think that's part of the idea of repetition in this episode. Through repetition comes meaning. And as Melanie tries to find meaning in this book, the devil with the yellow eyes appears behind her and the book attacks her, disfiguring her hand as she pays the price for her curiosity, like the woodcutter in the story. But let's talk about this closing shot and how it might connect to the final page of the book. Notice the illustration. It's a town that the angriest boy looks like he set on fire. And as David remains trapped in his memory, he's assaulted by all these angry voices, a repetition of that shot that we saw from episode 1. Now remember in that episode, the old man in Division 3 mentioned Red Hook, implying something bad happened there. Since then we haven't heard anything about Red Hook and we don't really know what it is, but I think Red Hook could be referring to a town that David went wild in, like the boy in the story. In fact, that might have been what we saw in that opening montage in episode 1 with everyone rioting outside a liquor store. And it's possible that all these screaming voices could be an entire population of a town that David killed or absorbed into his mind, or both. And on the outside, Sydney says this:
I'm not so sure those are memories.
This suggests what many of us have believed, that the reason Ptonomy and Melanie can't see everything in these memories is that not all of it is memory. It's various identities in his head speaking to him and terrorizing him right now. Okay, just one lingering question after this episode. Is Legion too scary? Personally, I don't think so. I love all this horror imagery. But it is another bold tonal choice that makes this feel less like a superhero show and more like the aesthetic of something like American Horror Story. But obviously with characters we actually care about. Okay, let me know what you think in the comments, and thanks for watching, and make sure to check out my breakdowns of the first 2 episodes too. Now, I'm gonna try to keep up with these weekly Legion breakdowns, no promises. Either way, we're gonna be doing more video coverage on Legion, but you can help us make more of these by liking this video, sharing it around, and spreading it far and wide. And if you like what we do here at New Rockstars, make sure to subscribe, and if you like, you can contribute to us on Patreon. Thank you so much to all of our current patrons. We love you guys. You can hit me up on Twitter at Erik Voss with any thoughts or theories that you have on Legion, or follow New Rockstars on Twitter at New Rockstars for updates on our videos. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.